Welcome to Highly Unlikely. I'm Jonathan Flannis. In today's episode, we talk with David Ditchfield. He's one of very few to have had what's called a near-death experience. So take a listen to David's story. It's one unlike any other. Enjoy.
The moment my life changed was December 14th, 1991, in a car accident in Charleston, South Carolina. I was hit at 75 miles per hour. I was literally knocked out of my body, and it was life-changing in many ways because it was at that moment that I realized that I had the choice whether to stay in my body or to exit. I knew that I was eternal. I knew I'd been here before, and I knew I would continue on.
Darkness. I mean, darker than you can ever imagine. If I'm dead, I shouldn't be aware of this total darkness. It was getting lighter and lighter. Then the next thing I knew, I was on the edge of what I thought was a cliff.
We were stuck, and I was cold though, and I'd never been that cold, and I had frostbite on my fingertips and my nose and my toes and my cheeks and my chin, and I had hypothermia.
But I also noticed right away that I had no body. No arms, no legs. It was like my third eye was it.
I then started to see this light that was incredibly bright. It didn't hurt my eyes. And all the physical pain and everything that was going on back in the room sort of disappeared. And the closest I can call it, it felt like I was so supported and so loved. And as I was moving towards this light, I saw a triangle of people. And at the front of the triangle was my granddad, Sam. Oh my God, Granddad, you look so well. I was so happy to see him. He looks younger, he looked well. Obviously he's dead.
But then I just remember going down, and I really did think I was going to die at that point.
Darkness. A sea of nothingness surrounds you in every direction. Empty space extending in infinite directions, endlessly. Is this what happens when you die? That's been the assumption I've held for most of my life. Nothing good or bad, depressing or happy, just nothing. But what happens when you take your last breath? Most of us won't know until we get there. But what happens when you die and come back? Our guest today knows what that's like. He's one of very few to have had what's called a near-death experience.
In all fairness, life for me was a massive struggle. I just felt like I just didn't fit in.
This is David Ditchfield. I first came across David's story in the British newspaper The Atlantic. In it, he described what it's like to die and come back. This is known as a near-death experience. I imagine you've heard about them. But from those I've read about, David's is undoubtedly the most fascinating. In today's episode, we hear David's story from a terrifying accident that left him near death, only to come back again.
The pathway that led me to the actual NDE itself.
The phrase NDE is short for near-death experience.
Was that my life needed to change. First of all, I wasn't loving myself. I got no sense of self-worth or self-love.
At the time of the near-death experience, David had moved to London to start a new life.
Like a lot of people who move to the capital cities, like New York or London or Paris or Rome, you go there with high ambitions and you want to do something big, and I just thought, well, I'm not cutting it within any form or fashion. Because I'd left school without all those qualifications, I felt like I was a failure. The only work I could pick up was manual work that I was no good at. The only thing is I really wasn't that great at that kind of work. I was looking at the other guys around me thinking, wow, they're just really on the job and they're brilliant at this, and I wasn't. Life was not enjoyable. I learned to play guitar very basically, so I was joining sort of various bands and I was hoping to cut my teeth, as it were, in that industry, but I never did. It was very hard, to a very competitive industry. And I was just chasing after those kind of goals, chasing after all the kind of relationships that were out of my reach. So life was not really working out for me, I guess. So, David, this isn't working. You're chasing all the wrong goals. They're all sort of out of your reach. They're just not for you. That whole episode really was like a big life lesson.
David was feeling ashamed of how his life had turned out.
And I also carried an awful lot of guilt. I figured especially in front of my family, I always felt guilty because I felt that I was getting into trouble in my life because things weren't working out, and when I say getting into trouble, nothing serious, but I was drinking heavily. In all fairness, that was another thing, because I think that was all came with the line of work. You picked up your work by going to the bar, So you go I'd go to my local bar in the part of London I was living in, where everyone used to sort of like hustle work off the guys who were owning the sites, So I'd go in there and I'd end up spending all the money that I'd earned that day. Alcohol is another thing that you think that it's lifting you, but it's also, I realise now, it's a depressant. So it was a vicious circle. My brother, for example, he just kind of flew through school and went to university and did well. And I guess I felt that I couldn't live up to that. So I used to think, well, they must think I'm a complete mess. How come I turned out the way I did?
At this low in David's life, one incredibly unlucky incident would change his life forever and bring him face to face with his own mortality. It began with a jacket.
Well, it was actually a family heirloom. It belonged to my great aunt, and she just passed away. And so I said, it was a very good, beautiful quality coat. And it was perfect for that day because it was a freezing cold February day,
As he did every day, David walked down into London's underground. This time, David was joined by a friend named Anna, who he was sending off. David and Anna said their goodbyes. As the doors of the train closed, David noticed a pulling on his neck. It turns out his jacket was stuck in the train's door. As they usually do, David was expecting for the doors to open back up. However, he saw to his horror that the train was getting ready to leave. David tried to no avail to swiftly take his jacket off. He started to panic. David looked into the train to see if someone could fix the terrible problem taking place. In front of him was his friend Anna.
The look of terror on her face was just, I can see it now, really horrifying, for us both. Then the train just started to edge its way out. And then it pulled a tremendous amount of speed. You don't realise how much speed these trains actually accelerate at until you're on the outside of it.
The train continued to speed up.
I lost my footing. I remember hearing the gears kind of slipping through the gears really fast, and I ran with it at first, and I was hoping that the sheer force of the train and my body weight would release it, but it didn't. I actually got dragged along the platform, and even then, it wasn't going to release my coat, and I was literally sucked down between the edge of the platform and the train itself. Going down, and I really did think I was going to die at that point. And I remember it's almost like I heard this tremendous rip at that point, and then I went down into this darkness, and I just looked up, and it's like the side of the carriage doors seemed to sort of disappear into the sky. Then I was pulled into like this, sheer hell. And I was thrown around and tossed from pillar to post. I was banged against the platform wall and the train itself, and then I was just tossed around like a rag doll.
So David is thrown from the train to the wall, to the train to the wall, back and forth, back and forth.
It was like being thrown into a fast spin of a washing machine. Very, very dramatic. Fully conscious throughout the whole thing as well. I didn't black out at any point. And this seemed to go on for a long time. And then I suddenly found that I was thrown down to the ground, and I was lying between the track as the train continued to speed on above my head, and I could hear it just rattling away. And at that point I thought, it's still not over yet, even though I was lying on the ground.
So at this point, David is on the track, and he's panicking, thinking, what do I do so this train doesn't run me over?
I was in survival mode throughout the whole thing, and I remember thinking to myself, I got time to think it through, and I thought, remember all the Indiana Jones classic movies and James Bond where this happens? They just lie down flat with their noses right in the gravel. So that's exactly what I did. And I just kept my head down because I thought any part of the undercarriage of the actual train could just come along and whack me over the head, and that would be it. It'd be over.
Turns out Indy was right.
But of course it wasn't. It wasn't to be. That didn't happen. And the train finally sort of moved on, and then I just remember hearing it's kind of the sound of it disappearing into the distance, and I just thought, wow, I'm alive. I'd had from the oily track, and then looked up, and the first thing I noticed was this thick quality sheepskin coat was now ripped into shreds, and my arm had been, the top half of my arm had been cut off.
Although he survived, David's arm had been severed from his body.
There was a lot of blood, and I was in a bad way. But I was alive, so there was a mixture of complete horror, but a complete sort of relief to survive. What had happened? It had been severed from the elbow down, and so it was just kind of hanging on just by a thread, if you like. So being cut right open as well. I could see all the workings inside my arm. You know, it was all the skin had been ripped right open as well. There was a part of it was horror was like going through my head, but there was another part was kind of this odd fascination that I could see all the workings inside me, and I was kind of looking and wow, that's the inside of me, that's the inside of my arm, and that's how it all works. I could see all the tendons and everything. But so people kind of go, wow, that's mad you were thinking about that, but you know, that's shock as well for you, you know, and it's just after going through something so huge, there's a lot going through your head, you know. Often people go through this process that if they're facing like my situation where they know they're probably going to die, that their mind goes into a survival technique that it kind of slows down. Like, for example, the rail police did a massive inquiry on the whole accident, and they told me that they'd worked it all out, that it took 7.5 seconds from the moment the train pulled off for me going under. Now that felt more like 7.5 minutes. What happened was I literally had time to think it through in my head. I'd seen this news footage about 2 or 3 weeks earlier where a small child had been thrown from a burning apartment block, because the children don't tense up, you know, they're very loose and relaxed. So I had time to even think that through. Within that 7.5 seconds, I thought, right, just relax, and that's your only chance at this stage.
David did his best to relax.
I was terrified, but at the same time, I was actually determined to survive this, and I was very relaxed. In fact, my friend Anna,
the friend on the train,
said to me when she came to visit me in hospital, and she said, and I saw you go under. She said, but when you went under, she said, please don't be upset by this, but you seem to go under with such grace. so she said you rolled under like really gracefully. And the other thing is as well, is quite interesting, that as terrifying as it was, actually facing death and thinking you're going to die is not as frightening as the anticipation. If somebody had said to me moments before, right, you know, your coat's going to get trapped, you're going to go under this train, I probably would have been a heck of a lot more frightened than the actual moment of it happening.
At this point, David is on the tracks and trying to figure out what to do next.
The first thing I thought was I better get my cell phone out of my pocket and call my sister to let her know what just happened. I don't know why, because I just figured that she could alert the emergency services. When I pulled it, I managed to pull it out of my coat pocket, and then it was the phone was completely smashed and it wasn't working.
But at this point, help arrives.
And then at that point, the people came running up towards the edge of the platform, you know, and the emergency services were there, like, really, really quick. And these guys just kind of jumped down onto the track and started cutting into the rest of my clothing, and you know, managed to get me onto a stretcher and lift me up at this huge drop, you know, from the platform edge.
Emergency services rushed David to an ambulance.
I remember they got me into the ambulance, and the doctor who was there turned around. He said, "Look, there's a hospital just around the corner, but I think the one that's going to save you is a further distance. Can you hang on?" I said, "Yeah, let's go." And I'm so glad we did, because it was Addenbrooke's Hospital, which is kind of like one of the main sort of university hospitals. Yeah, there was. I was in agony. I was in absolute agony, and but shock, yeah, was also helping me, I guess.
David arrives at the hospital and is greeted by a team of doctors. At this point, he's losing blood. Things really aren't looking good.
We arrived at the hospital, and there was like this team just waiting there for me, you know, as they got me into the emergency department. When I was on this trolley, I could see it was like a big arc of people and stuff, and they got me straight in there. So there was a lot of frantic sort of voices, you know, all these doctors sort of shouting out all these different things, you know, medical terms and stuff. I remember just before they wheeled me into surgery, I begged him. I said, "Look, you know, can you save my left arm, please? I play guitar, you know, that's all I was concerned about." And he said, "I'll do my best," and so he did. They saved it, you know. But I mean, after 3 major operations, you know, it's still there. It's not functional. I can't play the guitar anymore. But I'm still glad I got it. They managed to sort of save initially save all the tendons and that needed to be saved. I mean, it took 18 months or so before I could actually use even my fingers, you know, because everything just kind of like, nothing worked at all.
Back in the hospital, David's survival isn't a sure thing.
I was losing copious amounts of blood by then, and so it was... by then the pain was really kicking in, and the blood loss was getting higher.
As David lies there in excruciating pain, something strange starts to happen.
And I suddenly went from that into what I felt like a really peaceful, sort of darkened room.
David takes a look around and notices he's somewhere else.
I could see all these beautiful orbs, like colours of orbs that were like kind of pulsating all around me. They were like oranges and greens, and this made me feel very calm. I'd gone from all the overload of sand and light, you know, like this fluorescent light screaming into my eyes. I'd gone into this beautiful dark place, and then I remember all the pain had just gone from my body altogether. If you went somewhere like a lovely dark chapel that was very peaceful, and they just got candles lit all around you, I guess that's the best way to give a similar example. But it wasn't candles that were lit. They were like these pulsating colours, you know. They were just amazing. They were just like these beautiful orbs, you know, like quite large orbs. But and when I say pulsating, because it was very slow, flashing of colours, and they were just like all these kind of crystal colours, you know, all the different colours of the rainbow, if you like. But they weren't bright lights, they were just very calm and calm lights. I looked to see where I was, and I was lying on this big piece of slate. It was like a sort of rock. It was almost like a huge altar, like a medieval altar, if you like. And then at that stage, I looked down at my body.
Looking down at your body from above tends to be universal for those that have had a near-death experience.
And I realised that I was covered in like a blue cloth blanket or whatever, you know, and that comforted me. All my injuries had gone, you know. My arm was intact, there was no scars, there was no blood, there was nothing. Everything was totally healed. And I thought, wow, where am I? And I just figured then, at that point, that I must be dead. That this is it. I've finally moved on. And I had no sense of fear or shock about that. I was really quite happy to be there. And then, basically, what happened then, at that point, I felt a presence near me, and I looked, and then just at my feet, in this darkness, I just saw this glowing sort of figure with beautiful sort of white blonde hair, like an androgynous figure, androgynous being, you know, of light, with this luminous skin.
This first entity would change David's life.
That first person is probably the most important person that was greeting me. I know now that it was ultimately my spirit guide and my spirit guide, and we've all got spirit guides. We can call upon them, and that's something that I do. It was like an androgynous being. It's almost like you are my ultimate soulmate and guide, you know. Telepathy was telling me that I'd known from a past life.
In a near-death experience, communication is most often not done verbally. David was caught off guard by his guide's clothing.
That guide was wearing like a contemporary black t-shirt, you know, something that you and I would wear. It wasn't like some kind of Star Trek sort of outfit or whatever, you know. It was very contemporary. And there was no movement. This guide was just stood over me, just looking over me, and guarding me. And it's interesting because, as I said to you before, right up until that point, I was feeling guilty, and guilt was my middle name, as I called it. But I didn't feel any sense of that anymore. All that had gone. I just remember thinking, oh well, I'll see my family later. They'll deal with what's happening, and I'll see them when they come through to the other side. I felt like I'd known that person all of my life. There was a familiarity about that person's face as well. And I thought, who are you? I know you, don't I? I know you. But who are you,
As common as looking down at your body during a near-death experience is seeing a tunnel of light. If you walk into the light, you've decided to leave the world behind you.
I laid my head back on this slate rock, and as I did, I looked up and I could see like grids of white light were just kind of coming into me, and as I looked at those three grids of light, I just couldn't take my gaze away from them, because it was like a pure white light that was almost like healing me. It's the kind of white light that you wouldn't be able to look at normally, if it was like, like sunlight or even electric light, it was that powerful, but it was this I could look straight at. And then it was at that point I suddenly felt that this sensation of love that was coming from this being was kind of suddenly getting stronger, more powerful, and I realized that there were two other female forms either side of me. One of them was kind of like a sort of Asian Indian American, and then the other one was like sort of white Caucasian, I guess, and they were like, they had their hands kind of like just hovering over my body. And I could feel this healing power that was coming from their hands. It was almost like every molecule of me was just vibrating with this beautiful energy. I thought, well, this is it. This is the next stage. This is really amazing.
A feeling of peace and acceptance of death and mortality is a common feeling during an NDE.
It wasn't really like full hands-on. It was just hands just moving all over my body. And as I say, it felt more like they were healing my soul, because my soul had just been through incredible trauma. And I suddenly started thinking about my family down in the hospital, because I thought, well, they must be in complete state of shock at this stage, and because they already were pretty shaken up, and now they would be standing over my dead body because I figured I was dead. So I thought, well, I'd better look and see if I can see them. So I kind of leapt over the edge of this kind of big rock to my left, hoping to see them down in the hospital. I didn't see them at all, but what I did see was like this incredible sight. It was like a huge arc of stars, like a waterfall of stars into other galaxies and into like infinity. And there was like shooting stars that were dropping down through the middle, and I just thought, wow, look at that. And the energy was just, it was remarkable.
A waterfall of shooting stars.
Because the fact that it was in the form of a waterfall is the best way to describe a waterfall of stars. Standing at the edge of Niagara Falls, I guess, and not that I've stood there, but I've seen it.
At this point, David would meet someone even more incredible than those he's met.
It was at that point that I suddenly felt there was an even more powerful energy seemed to be connecting with me. And so I lifted my head again, and then I could see just above me, beyond the other being, was this huge kind of tunnel of white light that was coming towards me.
Witnessing a tunnel of light is very common in near-death experiences.
There were like these flames of oranges and yellows, and it was almost like all the forms of love you've ever experienced in your life, all condensed. And I just figured right at that point that this was the source of all creation. This is God. This is where it all comes from.
Try to imagine what that felt like. Being face to face with your God. As David absorbs this life-defining incident, something happens.
And then I was suddenly I was back at Earth. I was back in the hospital, and I was like laughing and smiling to myself. And I was lying on the hospital trolley, and I'd gone from all that tranquility and beauty to the sheer overdrive of noise and lights, and the doctor still frantically trying to save me,
After hours of operations, David survives. But what do you do once you've had this experience?
Everybody's near-death experience is different in terms of time. I mean, the one thing that is really fascinating for me was that because when I came through, as I say, I didn't know why I'd been sent back and why it had all happened. When I finally got out of hospital, I was recuperating at my sister's house, actually, and I remember they set me up a computer for me in the room, and I went straight online trying to find out about it. And that's when I discovered the term near-death experience. And one of the first images I came across was a drawing that had been done by a small child who'd had an NDE. And I couldn't believe it because this started my painting at that point. And it was like a child's image. It was just like a stick person lying, which was her, lying out on this table with 4 legs, with this blue sort of square covering her body.
Remember the blue cloth that covered David's body?
And the same colour of blue, which is like a light blue. And then
that wasn't all.
3 figures with stick arms out over her body.
Remember the 3 figures that David met?
I remember I called my sister in. I said, Janet, come and look at this. Come and look, and she nearly cried. That's amazing, isn't it? And the honesty of children, we always say this, don't we? It's like, I remember Picasso said that, he wanted to try and paint like a child because children paint from the heart. It's completely honest. It was brilliant seeing that, yeah. And that's always stayed with me, that image, and I've still got it.
The NDE would completely redefine David's reality.
Religion and faith wasn't something that was a part of my life at all. Especially when I first came around, when I was in the hospital, I felt like I was still connected to the other side, like a cord of me was still there. People say to me, "Oh, you must have been really disappointed and angry that they sent you back or that you were back in the hospital," but I wasn't at all. Because I was just so charged with all this beautiful energy. I'd been to somewhere beautiful and they sent me back for a reason. I didn't know what it was. I figured I was the only person that it had happened to at that point, but I now realise that, there's many other people have had near-death experiences. When they've done research into people who've had near-death experiences, everyone says the same thing.
David's right about how incredibly similar near-death experiences are.
It's as real as you and I are talking now. There's an intense consistency.
David's near-death experience completely transformed how he sees himself.
This is the most amazing thing about all this, Jonathan, is that you're just given all this confidence that I'd never had before. Everything seemed feasible.
So having spoken to David and done some research on him, David is a true Renaissance man. He does it all.
Hearing all these melodies coming through, and then I'd record them and put them all together. So I was hearing instruments coming through to me. Again, I was like channeling instruments through, like horns and flutes and stuff. And I just developed the first movement of this piece of music. And then I got in touch with my friend, my new cello friend, and said, "Look, I've got like a movement for that I was talking about for that piece of music. Would you be interested in looking at it?" She said, "Okay." So she turned up with someone else who was like one of the heads of the orchestra, and we met for coffee, and they looked at this score and they said, "Yeah, this looks really good, we'll do it."
David's orchestra was a massive success, and people were fascinated by the near-death experience that inspired it. David was becoming a celebrity.
"Would you be okay?" They phoned me about a week later. They said, "Are you okay to talk to the local press just about your piece because we're going to be performing it? Just say a few words." I said, "Yeah, cool." So that's what I did. And the local press really loved the story because I told them what it was about. I said and everyone knew in the town about my accent. It had been all over the news, mm-hmm. So they knew about me. So they went, "Oh, you're the guy who went under the train. This is great." And then suddenly the phone didn't stop ringing, and so then it went from that and it went into national press, and then the BBC wanted to come and film me. So the concert sold out 2 weeks in advance.
Because David's story was now nationally known, new safety measures were added.
One of the positive things to come out of this, that after my accident, and I didn't even know about it, I saw it on the main BBC News a year later, that 7 changes, safety changes, and one of them was the actual doors.
You'll remember the alligator doors are what kept his jacket from being removed.
When you look at automatic doors on the subway or on your trains or whatever, they're always kind of like this kind of rubber as they close. on these trains, it's almost like a crocodile teeth sort of effect, because they were made like that to stop the doors from opening as the train was going along. It was a way of holding them together because they thought that was a safe way of holding the doors together. So that's why I couldn't release my coat, because it was trapped within this kind of zigzag sort of crocodile rubber effect that was going all the way down. They scrapped that all together, but that's why I couldn't get it out, yeah.
But the doors weren't the only problem.
I just couldn't understand why there wasn't a guard on the platform at that point, but I realised afterwards that they'd made staff cuts to the actual station, and so it was all controlled by video camera. But this is the crazy part, that there was a woman who was watching it through CCTV. She watched it all happen, and she was helpless to alert the driver. She watched it all unfold, but she couldn't, she was just working on signals and stuff. So, and she'd already given the go-ahead or whatever for the green signal. But all that has changed. It's a much safer setup there now.
But the results of the NDE weren't all good. Soon David was showing symptoms of PTSD, and they weren't getting better.
It wasn't until 6 months later that I suddenly hit a wall, in my mind. I got post-traumatic stress. That didn't hit me until 6 months on, and I think it's because I was being carried by the actual energy of the whole NDE that I thought I was okay. But I'm a physical, human being, and my mind can only cope with so much, and so it caught up with me, so then I started having therapy after that. So I had to deal with the post-traumatic stress disorder, and I had to deal with the fact that at that point I couldn't drive, and I needed to get back on the train again. So I went through a lot of therapy because I was determined to get back to that station and get on a train. I couldn't even face going anywhere near the station at that point.
So David dove headfirst into the therapy process.
I did so many different forms, and so I remember I used to come out. I remember I'd get on the wrong bus and I'd be going completely the wrong way home and stuff, and then I'd suddenly realise, well, where am I? So that I found that really tough.
He did it all.
We do cognitive therapy, and we do. There was all sorts. We tried every single form in the book, I guess. But I went to see a clinical psychologist, and I found that to be really good actually, because he helped me to understand the way the actual brain works. And it was great to have somebody turn around and say, look, this is how your mind works. This is why you are feeling this. This is why you felt that. I'm a massive fan of therapy.
Since then, more and more researchers are studying near-death experiences.
In fact, the hospital where I was, they were doing research there.
Probably the hardest part about a near-death experience is having to defend your credibility when you share your story with others. Nobody wants to be laughed at.
Obviously I've had journalists question me on it. I remember I was on a drive time radio show here, and the DJ came on or whatever, the guy who was doing the show, the radio presenter I should say, and he interviewed me, and I talked through the story in a nutshell, and he just turned around and he said, look, we've got to go to the news break now, but I want to carry on after this. This is great, so. And he talked to me off air, and he said, look, this is brilliant. I want you to keep going. I said, I will do. So I carried on talking about it. And after I'd come off air, he was turning around, and I could hear him on the radio still talking about it. He said, this is mad. He said, I'm a journalist. I'm supposed to just wade in here and just pull this guy all apart. He said, but I couldn't do, because it's just so fascinating. And what I'm realizing is it's nothing to do with me or my delivery or anything like that. It's to do with the fact that at the end of the day, we don't think about death in Western society as a taboo subject, so it's never really talked about. So if somebody like myself and other people who've had NDEs discuss it and discuss death, and there's nothing to fear, then a lot of people are going, well, yeah, this is great. We should think about this more, because we don't. Not since medieval times. In medieval times, people thought about death, because they were surrounded by it. People were dying of the plague and all sorts of things, and so it was talked about. But since then, it's a taboo subject. Beneath all our layers, of the ego, as we call it, is our inner genuine soul, and that soul is a beautiful soul. And if we can only nurture it and learn to love it for what it is, and not try to make it into something else, then your guides will come through and help you to nurture that soul and bring it into fruition.
Maybe one of the biggest gifts the NDE gave David was a complete lack of fear around death.
I'm not saying that we should talk about death, every day over our morning coffee and stuff. It's not that, but we're all going to face it at some point. It's going to come to us all. So I don't know why it's not embraced. For me, it's very important to try and tell people that we shouldn't fear death. That it's not the end.
For more about David's story, take a listen to this.
The website is called shineonthestory.com. So if you go on there, you'll be able to see my paintings. There'll be links to my paintings. There'll be links to my music as well, so you can stream the music for free, so you can hear the music that I've just been talking about. And follow me if you want on Facebook. It's David Ditchfield NDE. You'll see the link for that on there. Also Instagram, I put my paintings up, and go to shineonthestory.com and it's all there.
You've been listening to Highly Unlikely. I'm Jonathan Flannis. Stay tuned.